For those of you who may not know me, I'm Jordan Money. I'm the Director of Events and Communications for the school, for the Center for Security Studies. And I am very pleased to introduce our lunch speaker today, Dr. Rebecca Lissner. Dr. Lissner is a non-resident scholar here at the Center for Security Studies. She also is a professor at the U.S. Naval War College and has held research fellowships all over the place at University of Pennsylvania's Perry Worrell House, at CFR, and the International Security Studies Department at Yale. She previously served as a special advisor to the Deputy Secretary at the U.S. Department of Energy, and she has her undergraduate degree from Harvard and both her master's degree and doctorate from the Department of Government here at Georgetown. The Department of Government is co-sponsoring this event today, and we hope that there are some government folks in the audience here. I know Dr. Lissner is a proud alumna of their PhD program. Her research and writing focuses on U.S. national security strategy and how that fits into the international order. And she is here to talk about her most recent book, which she co-authored with Mira Rapp-Hooper. It's called An Open World: How America Can Win the Contest for 21st Century Order. She's also working on a manuscript that looks at the effects of military interventions in American grand strategy. And her scholarship has been published just about any of the political science magazines that you cared to look at, as well as Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Washington Quarterly, and others. Dr. Lissner, thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jordan. It's really a pleasure to be back at Georgetown. As you said, I spent quite a bit of time in the government department. I'm delighted now to be affiliated with the Center for Security Studies. So I'm really happy to be here and appreciate all of you taking the time during your lunch hour to talk about my new book. Before I dive in, I just have to give my requisite disclaimer that I'm speaking only here in my personal capacity, not on behalf of the Naval War College, Department of Defense, or the Navy, of course. So the book that I want to talk with all of you about today is called An Open World: How America Can Win the Contest for 21st Century Order. And this book is really a call to action because it makes the case that the US has to reimagine its foreign policy for a post-pandemic and potentially, we'll find out perhaps next week, but post-Trump world before it is too late. And my co-author, Mira Rapp-Hooper, and I began this book in the immediate wake of the 2016 election, when it was already abundantly clear to us that Donald Trump himself was more an avatar than an architect of the massive domestic and international changes that were reshaping US foreign policy. Because the fact is that even if Hillary Clinton had won the presidency in 2016, she too would have had to contend with adverse power shifts, rapid technological change, and acute domestic political dysfunction. So in crafting this book, Mira and I set out to push back against two pieces of conventional wisdom that were prevalent at that time and I think continue to pervade the foreign policy discussion. The first was the idea that President Trump himself was solely responsible for the collapse of American global power and the so-called liberal international order. And second was the related hope that the United States could somehow return to foreign policy business as usual once Trump left office, whether in 2021 or 2025. So by investigating the long-term domestic and international shifts that predated Donald Trump and will outlast him, our research actually anticipated the foreign policy emergency that Washington now so clearly faces. Because the COVID crisis has tragically illustrated our central thesis, which is that an international order that was built for the world of the 1940s is utterly ill-equipped to meet both the challenges and the opportunities of the 2040s. So the United States needs to embrace a new approach. Before I say a bit more about what that new approach would look like, let's spend a moment focusing on those trends that predated Trump, predated COVID, and will be with us even when both are gone. So to begin internationally, even before COVID, American primacy was waning as West-East power shifts and technological change fueled China's rise, and undermined a US-led international order that no longer reflected the global distribution of power. China, now fueled by several decades of rapid growth, has the largest or second largest economy in the world, depending on how you measure it. And its military power has expanded in parallel. And although China rose within the US-led order, it now seeks to revise that order to better reflect its own power and preferences. And we see this whether in the South China Sea or at the World Trade Organization, where China is pushing for a change to global rules that protects its own domestic prerogatives. Meanwhile, the international order that in many ways emerged after World War II and then transformed after the end of the Cold War is becoming increasingly outmoded due to rapid technological change. And this change is requiring new forms of international governance that have thus far not been forthcoming. For example, there are no meaningful global rules for cyberspace, like restrictions or guardrails that are agreed upon among states that would prevent attacks on critical infrastructure like energy grids or electoral infrastructure, as we're seeing right now. There are no meaningful global rules for the internet, like protections for your data when you use an app owned by a foreign entity like TikTok. And there are also no meaningful global rules for AI or automation, like limits on how autonomous weapons or other types of autonomous systems might be used in warfare. So these two trends actually intersect with each other, because as technology increasingly becomes a central theater of great power competition, China is seeking to write rules that protect its domestic model of techno-authoritarianism and that advance its commercial interests globally, while the US is in many ways struggling to respond. But in its effort to craft a post-primacy, post-pandemic, and potentially post-Trump approach, the US faces some significant domestic challenges. And these are actually challenges that may prove more determinative of America's future international position than anything that's happening out there in the world. Because even before the pandemic, domestic divisions were causing the US to operate well below its own capacity. And there are two divisions in particular that are especially important and that we highlight in the book. The first is partisan polarization, or the growing divide between Democrats and Republicans, which have increasingly sorted themselves into two opposing blocs, whether at the elite level in the way that centrist legislators have mostly disappeared from Congress, and we see many more party line votes on the Hill, like the one we saw, of course, with the Coney Barrett nomination and confirmation just yesterday. But it also has to do with the way average Americans interact with each other. A phenomenon called effective polarization has resulted in actually antagonism between Democrats and Republicans that make the act of compromise itself less palatable. And of course, media polarization has resulted in distinct information ecosystems such that Democrats and Republicans are decreasingly able to agree on a basic common set of facts. And this partisan polarization, which is a long-term trend, has many pernicious consequences, but some are specific to foreign policy. A polarized America is less capable of developing and executing long-term strategy. It is more volatile because foreign policy tends to swing whenever the White House changes hands between a Democrat and a Republican. And it encourages political leaders to back irresponsible policies without fear of recourse from their loyal political bases. Of course, it also in many ways abets foreign interference in our domestic electoral processes by making manifest to foreign adversaries the fissures within the American polity and hindering the United States' ability to respond to foreign election interference, precisely because it is known to have benefited one candidate, which makes that party less apt to respond, something else that we're seeing play out in the news today. But that's not the only division that is hampering the United States and its foreign policy. The other one has to do with the divide between Silicon Valley or the tech sector and the federal government. Now, the US government has underinvested in R&D and basic research ever since the end of the Cold War, whereas at its peak in the 1970s, the US was investing on the order of 2% of its GDP in R&D and basic science. Today, that number is well below 1%, something around 0.7%. And what that has meant is that in the absence of federal funding and investment, American tech companies have been chasing market incentives rather than the national interest. And that may mean that they are chasing market share overseas. It may also mean that they are neglecting commercial technologies that have important national security applications, but aren't as lucrative as other elements that they might focus on. At the same time, the US government has been under-regulating those technologies and failing in many ways to adopt useful commercial technologies for national purposes because the government itself has atrophied its own technology, knowledge, and talent. And over the course of 2020, with the COVID pandemic, we've seen that these domestic underinvestments and these domestic divisions are even graver than we knew, as the US has struggled to get off the ground any kind of tech-enabled contact tracing app that might have come out of Silicon Valley. And partisan polarization has infected, for lack of a better word, even our public health response to COVID, as the wearing of life-saving masks has become politicized. So what this amounts to is a fairly consistent picture. The United States is a country that is still mighty by many metrics. It retains either the first or second largest GDP in the world, the only military capable of global power projection. The dollar remains the global reserve currency, and the US has unrivaled centrality in global financial networks. We retain a tremendous innovation base. Immigrants from all over the world want to come to this country, and we have a tremendous and unrivaled system of alliances. And yet, despite all of those advantages, the United States is performing tragically below its own capacity. And what these trends spell, both at the international and the domestic level, is in many ways the demise of the liberal international order that has prevailed in the post-Cold War period. And frankly, the demise of the liberal international order should not be very surprising to those of us who study international relations, because international orders always change when power shifts. And for all the reasons that I just discussed, power has actually been shifting for some time. So the United States, to chart a new course, needs to begin to really account for those changes. Now, just to be clear, what is international order? International order is the norms, the rules, and the institutions that govern international politics. And of course, precisely because these orders always reflect great power preferences, the so-called liberal international order was just one possible form of order, not the only one. The LIO was the one established by the United States and victorious allies after World War II, although it had earlier intellectual origins in Wilsonian internationalism. It was, of course, never fully liberal, fully international, or fully ordered. The UN system itself was universal, but the advent of the Cold War and the descent of the Iron Curtain created two opposing camps of order that were layered on top. The order itself evolved over time with decolonization, and it experienced crises like the Bretton Woods crisis in the 1970s with the end of the gold standard. So it was really only with the collapse of the Soviet Union that the liberal international order really surged to prominence as a term and began to seem universal. The United States, unparalleled in its power after the end of the Cold War, at the dawn of the unipolar moment, for the first time, it really seemed possible that the end of history was upon us and that liberal markets and liberal political systems might spread inexorably to all corners of the globe. But if it wasn't obvious before COVID, it's certainly obvious now that American primacy is in its twilight. China is continuing its ascent. International power is diffusing to a number of other middle powers as well. And what that means is that the international order simply cannot endure as it was. So my book with Mira, An Open World, turns the question to what comes next? What do we do? And our book argues that the US should shift from this concept of liberal universalism to a different idea, the idea of openness as the guiding principle of its grand strategy and approach to international order. We argue that an openness strategy would allow the United States to secure its dearest interests and values, even though it has lost military and economic primacy. So what does openness entail? The core objective of openness is to keep the world open, to promote open and transparent interactions between states, and to promote those interactions within the context of international institutions that are themselves also open and transparent. So what that means is, first of all states should be able to make free and independent political choices without foreign interference in their domestic decision-making processes, and certainly without outright domination by a more powerful nation. Second, international waterways, airspace, and outer space must all remain open and accessible for commercial and military transit, which means that countries like China and Iran should not be able to close off transit through important areas like the South China Sea or the Strait of Hormuz. And third, global cooperation and the free exchange of goods, services, and ideas should proceed and be governed through international institutions that are governed transparently and modernized for 21st century challenges. So thinking about those sort of three core ideas that guide an openness strategy, it becomes clear that there's really only one nation in the world, only one major power competitor that both has preferences for closure as opposed to openness and the means to bring them about. And that country is China, because China itself could dominate Asia, whether through sort of outright domination like territorial annexation via military means, or it could dominate Asia through subtler 21st century means, like the use of technologies like 5G that might make it impossible for states in its region to make free decisions, might limit the flow of information and ideas, and might siphon international data for governmental use by the CCP. Now, even as an openness strategy really zeroes in on China as the chief antagonist to openness, an openness strategy does not imply that China or any other state can't have influence. In that, indeed, in many ways, it recognizes that China's growing power will mean that China does have growing influence, but it seeks to forestall Chinese hegemony or Chinese dominance in whatever form that may take over the coming decades. Openness also doesn't encompass all of America's interests. It's a necessary precondition for the United States to achieve its objectives in the world, but an openness strategy or the idea of an open world doesn't necessarily dictate specific policy decisions on every possible issue. And it's also important to recognize that an openness strategy does not exist without limits. It doesn't mean that the US has to throw open its borders to unfettered immigration or unfettered capital flows. And indeed, in some forms of emergency, like the pandemic that we're living through right now, an openness strategy is fully consistent with taking emergency measures, whether to close off US borders or take other forms of restrictions that might be necessary when living through something like a global pandemic. So just to be especially clear, let me just underscore the ways in which openness does depart from liberal universalism, because of course they are important in these distinctions. The first is the way in which an openness strategy acknowledges the need to live alongside a powerful and authoritarian China that is within the international order, but is unfortunately unlikely to liberalize anytime soon. So what that means is that the US and China will be competing on many issues while cooperating as mutual interests may dictate. And this is a variegated picture. So neither the universalism of the liberal international order, nor the sort of Manichaean binary of Cold War ideological blocs really captures the likely dynamic that we will see between these two great powers over the coming decades. Second, an openness strategy recognizes that the US does not need to dominate the world or to engage in regime change, whether armed or otherwise, to preserve its safety, security, and prosperity. But what it does need to do is rally other countries behind a shared ordering vision. And third, in building diverse coalitions for openness, we seek to include liberal as well as illiberal states, understanding that states' preferences on matters of international order are not strictly coextensive with their regime type. To put it simply, in a post-primacy world, the US cannot keep the world open on its own, and it also can't be too picky about its partners. So that militates in favor of a more expansive approach to coalition building in order to build coalitions for openness that may not be the same coalitions on every issue, but preserve a balance of power that tilts in the favor of an open world going forward. So in practice, an openness strategy would entail 3 policy pillars. The first is order modernization. With the liberal international order in its rearview mirror, an openness strategy would set out to rebuild a new one for the 21st century. That strategy would seek to modernize some existing international institutions like the UN Security Council or the WTO in collaboration with allies and partners. But it must also work to develop new regimes in or undergoverned areas in which the United States has a clear interest in setting open norms and rules. That includes climate, emerging tech, cyber, internet governance, and even trade. But it's also important to recognize that in a system that does include authoritarian great powers, the act of order building itself will be competitive, and a future order will not be either universally open or universally ordered. The second policy pillar of an openness strategy is for the United States to make a new set of national security choices. The fact is that the American foreign policy apparatus is under-equipped for the international environment it will confront in the future, as great power competition with China will span economic, technological, ideological, and military domains, while the perils of borderless challenges like climate change and pandemics are becoming ever more urgent. So what it really means to make a new set of national security choices is to rebalance away from the military and the Department of Defense as the leading instrument of American foreign policy and towards diplomacy and development. It's also going to mean that the US needs to pursue new forms of coordination within the government, with the US private sector, new forms of public-private partnerships, and also with partner nations, potentially in the construction of public-private partnerships that span many different countries. Like, for example, a 5G or an AI consortium that might pool efforts across a number of different nations to develop cutting-edge technology and provide alternatives to China. And the third pillar, by no means the least important one, and in many ways the most important one, is domestic renewal. And this, of course, begins with renewing US competitiveness, something that is no small task amidst a public health crisis, but also includes investments in education, infrastructure, and so on. But the fact is that it really can't end there, because what the United States needs to do is to work to bring its governmental capacity and the power and influence it brings to the international stage in line with its power, with its capabilities. And that means bridging the divide between the tech sector and the US government through game-changing investments in R&D and basic science. It means breaking down barriers to the flow of talent between the public and the private sector. And it means reforming the way the US government both regulates and procures from technology companies so that it can work better with cutting-edge agile startups while also dealing with larger technology companies and regulating them appropriately. And finally, an openness strategy really rests upon the enhancement of domestic resilience, because the fact is that an open world does have some negative externalities. If the US retained closed borders, didn't interact with any other countries, it would be less vulnerable to threats like pandemics. But the fact is that a closed world would be a more dangerous one for the United States. So we need to take steps to withstand those negative externalities that do come with participating in an open world, whether that means resilience in US supply chains or enhancing the domestic stockpiles of critical medical supplies so that we aren't caught flat-footed in the ways that we were over the course of this COVID pandemic. So before we turn open to Q&A, and I look forward to the discussion with this group, I just want to leave you with a final point, which is that the opportunity the United States faces today will not come again. We are today at the most consequential geopolitical crossroads, at least since the end of the Cold War, and maybe since the end of World War II. And what that means is that the US has a narrowing window of opportunity to revamp its foreign policy, to abandon its post-Cold War hubris in favor of a new strategy that is both disciplined and globally engaged. Because the fact is that America remains extraordinarily powerful. And with appropriate political will, it can turn this moment of domestic and global destruction into a moment of creation. But if it fails to do so, if the United States fails to seize upon this opportunity, then the results will be dire. Authoritarian rivals like China will consolidate their power, which will result in a world that is more hostile to US interests and values. And as we've seen so tragically over the course of this year already, without US leadership on global challenges, the pandemic that we're living through today may itself prove a mild harbinger of much worse disorder to come. So with that, I will conclude my remarks and very much look forward to the conversation with this group and to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lissner. So folks, I put this in the chat, but please do, feel free to either drop your questions in the chat and I will ask them, or you can use the raise hand function and I'll call on you and you can ask them out loud. But as we give folks a minute or so to kind of form their questions, I did want to ask I'll start things off with a question for you. Sorry, just one moment. Figure I will come on camera while I ask questions. So you talked a lot, like you made a very strong case for this kind of openness policy. But I wonder if I can ask you to do a little bit of, maybe this is prognosticating a bit, but how realistic do you think it is? And to what extent do you think either of the next administrations, whether that's a second Trump term or a Biden administration, how likely do you think it is that either of those administrations would move toward this kind of openness strategy?
Absolutely. Well, a week before the election, Jordan, that is certainly the question I think that would be on many people's minds. And I think the fact is that this strategy is much easier to imagine in a Biden administration than it is in a second Trump term. But if Donald Trump's team is serious about competing with China, they should consider it. So let me explain a bit about what I mean there. Now, so beginning with Donald Trump, I mean, it's pretty clear that some of the president's personal proclivities are in stark contrast to the core tenets of an openness strategy. Whereas the president has repeatedly expressed antipathy towards alliances, the strategy sees allies as being really critical and the need to modernize our alliances as being critical to the success in achieving an open world, where the president has sort of preferred authoritarian partners to democracies. We very much see democratic partners as being a focal point for cooperation, although not the only counterparties for cooperation. And of course, President Trump has frequently expressed hostility to international trade, whereas open trade and modernized trade with high standards is an important part of this strategy. That being said, the Trump administration, whether in its national security strategy or its national defense strategy, has been very clear that they see China as a great power competitor and in many ways, more dangerous than Russia in terms of the threat that it poses to American national interests. And if the Trump administration is serious about competing with China, it needs to think about the ways in which it can rally other states, allies, and partners to work alongside the United States in that effort. Because over the next decade, the geopolitical math is simply not in the United States' favor. We cannot do this on our own. Whereas combined with our allies, we have something on the order of 27 times China's GDP. So that's a really strong case for building a coalition and articulating an affirmative vision of the type of international order the United States does seek. Now, what certainly isn't going to work is withdrawing from international institutions and effectively ceding the field to China. So this is a place where an openness strategy would recommend a very different approach than the one that we've seen in a first Trump term, really engaging more thoroughly in, whether it's the WHO or certain UN bodies to try to modernize them, make them more effective, make them better, make them work according to our interests and values so that China does not do the same. Now, in a Biden administration, it's certainly easier to see this type of openness strategy taking hold, but we do need to be clear-eyed about the immediate and urgent crises that are going to be landing on a President Biden's desk on his first day in the Oval Office. We as a country are living through a health crisis, an economic crisis, a racial justice crisis, a climate crisis, and it's very likely that we're sort of on the brink of some kind of democratic integrity crisis as well, coming alongside the election. And those are all going to demand really immediate attention. So it's going to be much easier for a Biden administration to focus on those crises du jour rather than thinking about long-term strategy and building towards it. But nevertheless, I think that there is an opportunity for a Biden administration to early on articulate the core principles of an openness strategy as being the guiding vision, not only for international rebuilding post-COVID, but also for domestic reconstruction. And a Biden administration could work to embed the priorities and values of openness within its early crisis management steps to create a foundation for engaging in the type of order modernization and sort of longer term efforts that might become more feasible at a time when a Biden administration would have more bandwidth to focus on these types of strategic matters, having brought COVID more or less under control at home, dealt with the economic fallout, and so on.
Thank you so much for that response. And as either administration kind of moves ahead, I know the United States is in a in a relatively unique situation in the world, but are there nations whose strategy toward this the U.S. should be emulating over the coming years and decades?
That's such an interesting question. And I think what I like about it is it illustrates the type of humility that in many ways will be required of the United States to lead in a world in which we are no longer the world's uncontested superpower and no longer have the ability to unilaterally dictate global outcomes to the extent that we ever did. And I think there, you could really think about the idea that there is a global battle that is underway between forces of openness and forces of closure. And on the one hand, you have certain of America's allies, I think especially of Japan and Germany, who have been fighting really hard to keep the international system open at a time when the United States has retreated from leadership of that system. So in many ways, they do serve as sort of models, or at least they were bulwarks of an open system at a time when the United States has been looking elsewhere. So they, in many ways, are the countries to emulate and also the partners to join with, whether as a matter of modernizing the World Trade Organization so that it covers digital trade, digital services, so that it is more responsive to the concerns raised by Chinese intellectual property theft and illegal subsidies and state-owned enterprises, whether it's a matter of developing alternatives to China's BRI, development alternatives with both Japan and Germany have been involved with, whether it's modernizing and changing the composition of the UN Security Council, a priority for both Japan and Germany that is really required so that that body, which was constituted, at least in its permanent membership with the victors of World War II, better reflects current power realities. But the fact is that our allies like Germany and Japan are really struggling to uphold openness at a time when the US hasn't been a champion always for openness over the past several years, and also at a time when China and Russia are increasingly cooperating with each other for closure. So unless the United States really steps up as a force for openness and as a coalition builder for openness, it's going to be very hard, even for those countries who would ardently support these principles, to further them on their own. So I would say those are both the models and the partners that we should be looking to over the next several years.
Do you think that there is a point of no return here? Is there, I know that this is a long-term process and a long-term strategy. Say that the next administration doesn't really make this a priority, or even the next two. Is this something that future administrations should be coming back to time and time again, or is there a point at which it's going to be difficult to come back from this closed off strategy that we've been pursuing?
The timing here is really important. And I think the fact is that the US does have a small and narrowing window of opportunity to put forth the principles and to really embrace the strategy of an open world before it is too late. And the reason for that, I would say, is twofold. In the first instance, we are coming out of this massive global and domestic crisis, which has made many of the basic terms of both domestic and international governance newly malleable. And so the decisions that the United States takes and the world that emerges from COVID in many ways will set the tone for many decades to come. And the United States wants to be leading in that effort, and it wants to be crafting a post-COVID world, a post-COVID global economic recovery that reflects our interests and our values, and in many ways, the values of openness. That opportunity will simply not come again. The other reason why the US is in a unique position today is the fact is that we do remain extraordinarily powerful. We have all the advantages that I talked about before, whether that's in terms of massive economy, still the world's most powerful military, still unrivaled centrality in the global financial system. And the US needs to make good on these advantages to try to lock them in and encode them in a modernized international order before it is too late. Because the fact is that over time, China is going to continue to rise. The US will likely continue to decline in relative terms. And also many of our sort of historic allies are experiencing, especially in Europe and also in Asia, fairly sluggish growth rates. So the time is now to take advantage of the malleability of the international system in the wake of COVID, and also to really capitalize on the advantages that the United States still does have, and to show that we are really willing to lead once again, so that countries don't begin to hedge against the possibility of American retreat and make different choices that will make it much harder to keep the world open and build coalitions for openness in the future.
Thank you. And I have a question in the chat here from one of our audience members who's wondering if you could explain your comments a little more about working with illiberal partners. They say, obviously, the argument for building the largest and strongest coalition possible is sound, but could this strategy potentially undermine this concept of global openness? Where in your mind should the US and its allies draw the line?
It's a great question. So I think, to begin, countries that embrace openness domestically via democratic political systems, open societies, free speech, economic interdependence are, of course, the United States' natural partners in pursuing an openness strategy. Because the fact is that open societies stand to benefit the most from participating in an open world that fosters the exchange of people, information, ideas, and trade in a cooperative international system. And of course, it goes without saying that the United States itself needs to remain one of these open societies that is a leader and a democracy that stands for openness. But that has to come alongside a recognition that there are many countries like China and Russia that will be closed societies until their people choose otherwise, and that Beijing and Moscow prefer to change some, if not all, international rules and norms to make them friendlier to autocracies. So we need to really focus on how to guarantee international openness in spite of that fact. And what that means is that the United States does need to build diverse coalitions in favor of openness, understanding that democracies aren't always going to align with the United States' preferences for openness, and that sometimes liberal states will align with the United States' preferences for openness. So here we can begin by thinking about a country like India, which is itself a major rising power and a democracy. And it aligns in many ways with the United States' vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. And indeed, we've seen over the past day or so, US-India cooperation towards that end is actually growing much closer. But at the same time, India is liberalizing domestically. It has engaged in prolonged internet shutdowns in Kashmir, for example, in a way that actually aligns its preferences for global technology governance and order more with the sort of Chinese and Russian vision of cyber sovereignty, and less for the sort of open information systems that the United States has historically stood for. So even other democracies aren't always going to be on the side of openness, but we should be trying to recruit them to the extent that we can. Now, you can also think about illiberal states, which may not be on the side of openness or human rights on many important issues. Here you could think about a Vietnam, for example, but that does share the United States' interest in keeping the South China Sea open. So What this amounts to, I think, is a need to sort of decompose the idea of international order, recognizing that it's going to vary regionally, it's going to vary by domain, and that the United States will be able to find different partners in different areas. And so it's going to have to engage in an agile, multipolar diplomacy to try to figure out which countries do align with the United States' preferences for openness in what areas, trying to bring them on board as we seek to modernize and build new forms of order. And we can't simply default to regime type in order to achieve this, because I'll just conclude by saying the fact is that many of these countries, whether democracies or illiberal states or mixed regimes, don't really want to choose between the United States and China, and we shouldn't force them to do so. And so what that means is creating opportunities for cooperation with illiberal states, whether that means US-China cooperation on existential challenges like climate change, or narrower cooperation like military cooperation with states like Vietnam to keep the international waterways open.
And just as a follow-up to that, the same person added on, if you could talk a little bit about how Turkey and NATO fit into that same kind of question as well.
Absolutely. I mean, this is really tricky because it's important to recognize that all of our treaty allies aren't necessarily good partners. And Turkey has been a really challenging manifestation of this problem. So one argument that the book makes, and that is part of an openness strategy, is the idea that the United States, even as it sort of retreats from its recent posture of democracy promotion, trying to create democracy where it doesn't exist today, should still be engaging in robust democracy support, trying to prop up democracy where it does exist and using the levers that we do have in order to enforce that. And so Turkey is a really good example where there has been substantial illiberal backsliding and under Erdogan over the past period. And the United States does have levers that it can pull through NATO as a means to exert more pressure on Turkey to uphold the values of democracy and openness, to protect human rights, and so on. So the United States does need to be more assertive in taking advantage of the leverage that it does have through its alliances to impose certain types of penalties on those allies that are not abiding by our common values as embedded in organizations like NATO. But certainly no easy answers there. But it is an important element to hold these countries like Turkey up to the agreements on human rights and otherwise that they have already agreed to, and to impose costs to the extent that they don't.
Thank you. And I appreciate you giving us approaching the questions that don't have easy answers in all of this. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, we've talked about how various allies, different countries could fit into all of this and how they will fit into all of this. But can you talk a little bit about how private entities fit in? We have, especially right now with the election coming up, a lot of talk about how technology companies play a role in public life. Where do corporations, nonprofits, all of these other non-governmental entities fit into this whole strategy?
They're very important because one of the core arguments of the book is that state-society relations, or any country's ability to leverage its non-governmental forms of power for national interest, is going to be really determinative of geopolitical competition in the 21st century. So to be more specific, what that means is the United States' ability to leverage its private sector, and especially the innovation that comes out of its private sector, is going to be really important in competing with a China that has a fundamentally different model of innovation than we do. We've seen a China that has launched this Made in 2025 strategy with massive centrally directed investments in R&D and basic science. China has, state champions and very close relationships between even its nominally private tech companies and its federal government. There are CCP cells in all the major Chinese tech companies. And China has this sort of civil military fusion framework where the barriers between sort of civilian and military applications are often fairly blurry. So this is a formidable challenge, but the United States should not set out to replicate China's way of doing this, even as we do want to compete with it. So what that means is really moving towards a new approach to public-private partnership in the United States to make sure that our private energies and private capital and private innovation is being directed towards the sort of geopolitically necessary national ends at the same time as we are protecting the sort of innovation and vitality that does come from competition and free markets. So I think that will take a number of different dimensions. One, of course, as I mentioned before, is increasing the US government's investment in research and development and basic science. This is something that we did at very high levels during the Cold War. And in many ways, it was US governmental investments in things like the internet and semiconductors, which originally had more military applications, that have become the foundation for the United States technological advantage, which we're still coasting on in many ways today. So we really need to reinvest in that innovation ecosystem. That means that sort of whatever the technologies are of the future, and we don't know what they are yet, the United States remains a leader in innovating and developing them. But it also means that we need to recognize that the United States is not going to itself be a leader in all geopolitically salient technologies. So that's where these sort of international public-private partnerships might come in. You think, for example, about AI or 5G, where a lot of relevant talent and expertise actually exists outside of the United States. In the case of 5G, Nokia and Ericsson in Sweden and Finland are themselves the leaders in manufacturing 5G hardware, and therefore the primary competitors with Huawei. So what the United States can do is build these new public-private coalitions, for example, using tools of development financing in order to provide alternatives. Because the fact is that we are not going to beat China in every competition. We are not going to exclude China from every market. There are still going to be many countries that choose to use Chinese technology, Huawei, to build their 5G networks, for example. But the United States can work with its allies and partners to provide alternatives, to make sure that there are options that are cost effective, so that countries don't end up with Chinese technology simply by default. So thinking creatively about the various ways in which we can both bridge the gap domestically between the public and the private sectors, make it easier for people to go back and forth, realign incentives so that we're all moving in the same direction, is going to be a critical part of it. And also developing the tools to make sure that both US companies and US companies in concert with other foreign companies that are like-minded can work together in strategically directed ways to provide a diverse marketplace that enables more competition in the economic sense between sort of Chinese commercial alternatives and more sort of US-based commercial alternatives.
And there's something of a follow-up question here. Someone, as I asked that last question, put in the chat something very similar. That asked about, the public-private partnerships and bringing about domestic renewal and how that all fits in. They ask, how would this look different from a military-industrial complex?
I suppose it depends what your definition of a military-industrial complex might be, but certainly what this would look like is closer cooperation between the military and other national security agencies and the private sector. Because the fact is that many cutting edge innovations are happening in the commercial technology space, and the US government and the Defense Department in particular is at a disadvantage because it has fared quite poorly in adopting those technologies. And those really run the gamut from, better IT infrastructure that just makes the work of DoD more efficient. It has to do with managing healthcare records. It has to do with sort of optimizing supply chains or even maybe deployment patterns, many sort of logistical tasks that might be aided, for example, through big data and AI. But it also might take on other dimensions. For example, in the intelligence community, there has now been a proliferation of commercial space activity, and especially private and commercial satellites, which can provide an open source flow of intelligence that the United States could better integrate in its own collection efforts, and also more easily share with other countries with whom it is difficult to share classified information. But if we actually have, for example, satellite images that are coming from unclassified sources, it becomes much easier to circulate and thereby to sort of address a number of subtle challenges, mostly of the gray zone variety. So certainly there are elements of the military-industrial complex, as it's called, or military-industrial congressional complex, as Eisenhower called it, that entail waste, fraud, and abuse. And by no means is this an endorsement of that. But insofar as we're talking about closer cooperation between especially sort of agile startups and the U.S. government, that certainly is the type of relationship we should be working towards.
Thank you, and thank you for gamely jumping in on that, even though we didn't necessarily have a definition of which kind of complex we're talking about. We have, just a few minutes left until 1 o'clock, and nothing else in the chat right now. So this is perhaps a bit of a curious question, but is there a question you particularly love answering about this topic, or one that you wish people would ask you? And if so, what is that, and what's your answer?
Sure. So I guess I would say for this particular SSP audience that we ought to think about what power will entail in the 21st century and whom will be empowered. Because we have this sort of traditional definition of power as being sort of primarily economic in nature, because we think of military and economic power as being essentially fungible. But going forward, I expect that we will see certain areas, especially in the tech space, where technological power will not be strictly correlated with the size of a country's GDP. There are a lot of countries that are advanced democracies that have high-tech economies that innovate in important areas, whether that's AI or quantum computing or other areas that are themselves not large economies. And what that will do over the coming decades, I think, is tax the way that we traditionally think of power and force us to really conceive of it in a new and more creative way. So military power will remain important, but there will be these other sources of power that in many ways may be more usable and more salient going forward. And what that means in turn is that these middle powers that are able to sort of generate these new forms of power, the alignments that they choose will be highly determinative in terms of the future of international order, because they are going to be sort of engines of innovation, because their economic choices will matter considerably in building, different trade alignments. The United States really has to work hard to court middle powers and try to bring them along the side of openness with us. So I guess that is just sort of a call to expand our collective apertures, and we're thinking about how to conceive of and measure power in the decades to come, to really sort of look beyond the way that we've traditionally thought about military competition, and expand to think about what it means to be engaging concurrently in a military, economic, technological, and maybe also ideological competition, and what the interdependencies of those different elements of power might be, and also what the exercise of non-military forms of power for coercive means actually looks like in practice, and how we might go about doing that. So as you all go along with your own research and learning efforts, I would say that's an important question to keep in mind for the future.
Thank you so much. That feels like a good place to wrap things up. So thank you so much, Dr. Lissner, for joining us today, for answering our questions, for talking with us. Again, the book is called An Open World. It is available now if anybody wants to seek it out. And thank you to everyone in the audience who joined us today and stayed on for the full hour.
Thanks a lot for having me, Jordan, and to all of you for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.